Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are and when you're watching this, wherever and whenever that is. I hope that you and yours are safe and healthy and continuing to follow our public health officials as we work our way through a very unusual sort of time. This is Lesson 27, Atrocities and Genocide. Another exciting and hardly uplifting day, to say the least, as far as our historiography goes, but a vitally important part of understanding the Second World War. If you're following along with the slides, I'll let you know when I'm changing. Moving to course administration. Information for those of you who may be planning to graduate in summer has come out in the email digest. The email digest goes to your official CSU Pueblo address. If you don't routinely monitor that address, you need to start because a lot of important information is coming out via that source in the email digest. Please let me know if you have questions. Excuse me. I have reloaded all the assignments so they can be submitted via Blackboard. So if you have a late assignment to turn in, please go ahead and do that via Blackboard. Please also do it even if you have already emailed it to me and you don't have a response back yet. I know it's extra work for you to upload it to Blackboard when you've already emailed it to me, but it just makes my life a heck of a lot easier as I try to get caught up on grading, and I think by Thursday I should be completely done. Advising for fall 2020. You can go ahead and register. They've cleared all advising holds, so you are free to go ahead and register at will. But if you are not planning to graduate this summer and you need to talk to an advisor, it's certainly available. And as always, I strongly advise you to speak to an advisor from each of your major or majors and minor or minors. Certainly one advisor can help you out with everything, but for the details, especially as you're getting close to graduation, it's always best to talk to all of the involved departments. Let's see, that's about it otherwise. I think new stuff. Moving on to jobs. Yes, that people are still hiring out there. This would be a really interesting one for somebody who has a background in art as well as history, since T.C. Steele was an artist. Fairly important one, apparently. I admit I had not heard the name before, but I've learned a little bit. But this is a job as a site manager, essentially being the person overall charge of a relatively small historical site run by the state of Indiana. And this is the kind of job that many of you might be aspiring to, leading a historic site. As you can see from the list of things to do, it's fairly extensive, and some of it you're going to learn on the job. Maybe you could pick up, in fact, you definitely could pick up some of that through some good internships, so we'll keep that in mind too. All right, moving on to the writing tip of the day. Back in my military days, in our various exams, especially in the nuclear missile business where we had to pass multiple monthly tests to be continued to certify to do our jobs, the phrase RTFQ, which stands for read the question, came up a lot. And that's my advice to you, except you're also the author of the question. It's incredibly important. It's the most important thing in historical writing is to make sure you answer the question that you're posing. Make sure your writing actually answers the question that you set out, which is why I harp so much on coming up with a good historical question before you even really get into your research. But as you write and as you revise and as you proofread, there is a danger that you lose sight of that question. So make sure that your introduction and your conclusion explicitly state the answer to your question, also known as your thesis, and make sure that everything in between, all that stuff you're writing, is linked back to answering that question, to supporting that thesis. As far as tricks for polishing go, these probably aren't new, but I'll reinforce them since we're into our last week. Reading it out loud is the best possible way to guide yourself away from infelicitous constructions and nasty sounding phrases and stuff that just doesn't make sense, especially like things like leaving the word not out of a sentence. I've occasionally done that, and you find it when you read it out loud, I assure you. For peer editing, of course, I already twisted your arm and forced you to be a peer editor. But if you are seeking another peer edit for your process, choose wisely. And the good news is that everybody in our class would be a good choice. But if you're going outside our class, don't necessarily pick somebody who is a close friend or just because they're quarantined with you. They may or may not be the best choice. But think carefully about who you ask to look at your work and give you advice and whether or not you need to follow it. It helps if you can set up peer advising or peer editing in advance, i.e. let them know it's coming and give them a deadline when you need it back, as opposed to, hey, I'm going to turn this paper in. If you think it's okay, here, look at it. That usually does not provide you truly effective feedback. And if you have questions, get help. Ask your questions early in the process, or as early in the process as possible. Ask for help from peers, ask for help from me, but above all, don't turn your paper in with that unanswered question still floating around of that. And it happens when exhaustion sets in. You just say, oh, I just need to get this off my desk. Well, try not to do that. All right, moving on. As you can see, and the numbering is off, and I haven't figured out how to fix it as I'm moving back and forth between Mac and PowerPoint and all that sort of thing. But anyway, we're in the top right column, top of the right-hand column with Atrocities and Genocide. If you haven't watched Garrett's and Tristan's videos, please, this would be a good time to pause me and go do that. They both did a fine job dealing with some rather horrendous issues. I will point out that Tristan's videos kind of got buried in the list because he turned them in early, but they are there. It is there, rather, just one in his case. And on Thursday, looking forward to Conrad and Nathan leading us through victory and defeat. So that should be fun, figuring that stuff out. All right, well, our other readers took care of Ordinary Men, The Rape of Nanking, War Without Mercy, and Bloodlands. Interestingly, students chose the thickest of the books this week, or this lesson. I just note that because everybody's been commenting on how thick the books are. Well, I actually had the two thinnest ones, I do believe. Well, probably not Ordinary Men, but two of the three thinnest books to review today. I will start with Clarence Lussane's Hitler's Black Victims, The Historical Experiences of Afro-Germans, European Blacks, Africans, and African Americans in the Nazi Era. And I would now hold up a copy of the book, but I don't have one thanks to our working remotely. I didn't have a chance to get this one from Interlibrary loan, and it doesn't happen to be one that I own. This was actually one of the books I read for my doctoral fields, for my PhD exams a long way back, so I was able to dust off my notes even if I didn't have the book in hand. As you may have guessed from the length of the subtitle, Lussane is talking about a fairly diverse group of people, but also a very small one. Probably our best estimate is that there were about 1,500 black people in Germany in 1933, 1934, when the Nazis came to power. And by that, we include people who had come from Germany's African colonies, so people who were either born in Africa or had parents who were born in Africa or maybe grandparents and had migrated to Germany. We have half German, half Afro-French or half Afro-American German individuals who were the children of occupation forces in 1919, 1920, 1921, when the western part of Germany was occupied by the Allies. Some of the troops were either French colonial troops or African American troops, and they sometimes fathered children with German women. That was a relatively small population, but not a popular one in Germany. And also African Americans who visited Germany, or other Afro-Europeans who came under German control. But all said, we're not talking about large groups of people, and that's part of what's going on in this story. The Nazis were not fond of people of African descent by any stretch of the imagination, but they were never as systematically persecuted as the Jews or even the Slavs in Nazi ideological thinking. And one of the reasons Lusane argues this is so is there were simply relatively so few black people that in Germany and in specific and in Europe in general, that they were not really a threat. And because they could not be perceived, they could not even be perceived as a threat. While the Jews or the Slavs could be portrayed by the Nazis and were believed by the Nazis to be existential threats to the German nation, people of African descent simply weren't due to their small numbers. Another reason is that the German Foreign Ministry was trying to curry favor with the United States and with other countries, and one of the ways they did that was by playing up relatively good treatment of people of African descent by the Nazi regime, in part to distract people from the discriminatory treatment of Jews in early Nazi Germany, but also to show a positive contrast between the treatment of blacks in Germany and the treatment of blacks in the United States. So highlighting American racism as a way of minimizing German racism. That's not to say that Africans or people of African descent were not discriminated against in Germany. They certainly were. It simply wasn't particularly systematic. There are terrible atrocities. There are assaults. African or people of African descent were included in the sterilization programs, sterilized against their will to prevent them from having children. On the other hand, there at least seems to be some evidence that some black Germans were able to join the Hitler Youth and were able to live out their lives in at least a degree of freedom, or perhaps no more repressed than the rest of the Germans around them, than the white Germans around them. But in all cases, the sheer arbitrariness of the Nazi regime was problematic. You simply couldn't tell from day to day, or even from group to group, subgroup that is, what was going to happen. For example, it's not a highlight of this book, or not particularly focused on this book, the treatment of French African soldiers, colonial soldiers who fought in France for France in 1940 and were captured, were subject to mass executions and horribly mistreated by the Germans. So overall, it's an excellent book. Lusane does a very good job of dealing with the paucity of evidence, and part of that has to do with simply the fact that he's dealing with relatively small numbers of people. He does a very interesting, his final chapter is about some resistors and even partisans of African descent. That part doesn't entirely fit with the rest of the book, but again, we're talking about the function of small numbers. He's working with the evidence he has, and that's something that lesson we can kind of all take away as historians, that sometimes you just have to work with what you have, and that means you don't tell a completely smooth story, or you aren't able to fill in all the gaps that you would like to, or that your reader would like you to. Lusane also seems to have some problems with some German translations. That's not something my skill set helped pick out, but it is a sort of common thing I noticed in the various reviews I looked at. There are definitely some concerns about his translation of German terms, or his choices of translation of German terms. Nevertheless, he makes excellent use of the evidence that he is able to uncover, and it's a worthwhile look at an underrepresented or understudied topic in our history of Nazism in World War II. The other book, which I can now hold up because I happen to own a copy of this one, that I looked at, oh man, there's some serious glare, there we go, is Hitler Strikes Poland, Blitzkrieg, Ideology and Atrocity by Alexander Rossino. Rossino is a research historian at the Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies, and he is also, like Lusane, taking a look at a somewhat understudied topic, and that is the invasion of Poland. When it comes to studies of Nazi atrocities and the Holocaust, it's the invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, Operation Barbarossa, that is really the main focus, for good reason. That's really when Nazi atrocity and the military advance become almost synonymous. But Rosino takes us back to 1939 to the short campaign, the invasion of Poland, and sort of challenges our historical understanding of 1941 as a pivotal moment in the barbarization of German warfare. Rosino argues that the invasion of Poland involved the deliberate and premeditated use of atrocity in carrying out Nazi goals, specifically an operation called Operation Tannenberg, which was named for a German victory in World War I against the Russians. Operation Tannenberg, which was designed to destroy potential resistance to the Nazi conquest by eliminating the potential leaders in Polish society. So priests, government officials, military officers or reservists, teachers, small provincial officials, local elected officials like mayors, those sorts of people. So there was a plan in place, Operation Tannenberg, to eliminate these people in order to prevent any sort of Polish resistance from coalescing against German occupation. Since, as far as the Germans were concerned, this was going to be a permanent change of affairs. One of the points that Rosino makes that's very important, we still have a tendency, there's a little bit left in the historiography, though it's mostly been beaten back, to draw the distinction between bad Nazis and good Germans, to talk about how the SS and the Gestapo, they were bad Nazis and they did horrible things, but most German soldiers were good Germans who fought for their country and tried to protect their country and fought an honorable war. As some of the books we've already looked at should tell you, that's loaded garbage. But Rosino does is specifically focus on the 1939 campaign to talk about how the German army is compromised and involved in atrocities. Part of this comes from German army tradition. The German army has traditionally been very fearful of civilian uprisings, of unconventional warfare. It led to numerous German atrocities in World War I, mass reprisals, the taking of hostages for fear of civilian resistance, taking place in Belgium, in France. But it goes to another level in Poland, where the German army was a willing participant, even an enthusiastic participant in atrocities that it believed, or that its officers believed, would prevent the Poles from fomenting any sort of civilian resistance to German conquest and occupation. Sometimes this involved very close coordination with the SS Einsatzgruppen, the death squads that were specifically sent out by the SS to carry out Operation Tannenberg to execute certain specific individuals. Though Rosino is careful to note that this isn't always the case. There were actually a number of cases in the invasion of Poland, in the battles there, where German officers protested against atrocities and objected to the brutalization or murder of civilians in territory that was under their control, to the point of even sometimes actually arresting members of the Einsatzgruppen and of the death squads, arresting SS members to put them on trial for war crimes. This all came to naught because in October of 1939, Adolf Hitler pardoned all accused war criminals who had carried out any sort of atrocity in Poland. He simply issued a blanket amnesty and pardon for anybody who was accused of doing anything wrong during the Polish campaign. So there was never any justice done until after the war for any of those events. But Rosino does use it to show that this is things in 1939 are not the same as they are in 1941, even though we can definitely see signs that we're on the way. Now, you have to be careful as a historian that you don't look at what comes after and say, aha, that proves that what comes before leads to it. But nevertheless, Rosino makes a very good argument that atrocity is tied up in the Nazi project and in World War II, literally from its very beginning. They are not separable. They are not parsable in any way, shape, or form. I didn't comment on Lucene, but I'll say, but both Lucene and Racine are good writers. They're fairly easy to follow. I frankly don't remember a lot about the illustrations from Lucene's book, but the ones in Racino's really stand out. Not only because he found some excellent sources, because the way he organizes them. Not only are there uh, illustrations at various points, but he has two essentially photo essays. Um, one is called Reprisal in Seschawa for September 1939, and I won't show you every picture, but he chronologically takes us through and uses pictures that were taken by the Germans to illustrate all the stages of a reprisal. In this case, the Germans believe that shots were fired at them from a house, so they start pulling people from the apartment building. Excuse me, shots were fired from an apartment, so they start rounding up Poles from the from that apartment building. They round them up. They burn the apartment building, and they execute the people they'd seized from the building without any proof whatsoever that the Poles they arrested had anything to do with firing the shots. And the second one is shorter, but also very effective, called An Atrocity in Konski, which is when German troops, military troops, encountered gunfire. Four of them were killed, and so they rounded up local Jews, forced them to dig graves for the German soldiers, and then executed them. And this is where the picture that's used on the main picture on the cover. There's two. There's the smaller one about rounding up hostages, but the top one is a fascinating picture because the woman in towards the back there is actually Lenny. Excuse me. Water time. Is actually Leni Riefenstahl, who was a very famous film director. In fact, she was responsible for Triumph of the Will, which was the official propaganda film about one of the Nazi party rallies, and was it still is. If you're interested in film, well worth seeing. It's also good if you're interested in history, but you really get a feel from that movie about how the Nazis were able to glorify themselves and their program for Germany. Anyway, Riefenstahl and her film crew went to Poland along with the German forces to produce another documentary. And this was going to be a documentary about how wonderful it was to liberate the Germans, the ethnic Germans who had been living under Polish rule. And she got caught up, witnessed this atrocity and the murder of these Jews. And you can see from the look on her face that she is shocked and horrified by what she's seeing. So this was a bit of a moment for her and those who went with her. To sort of wrap up, I guess, what we're talking about today, as I said at the beginning, it's a hard topic. These are not easy books to read. As some of our presenters commented, there ought to be warning labels on it. I mean, if you there ought to be maybe ratings on history books that to warn you that really horrifying things are coming. But dealing with these sorts of bad things, really bad things, supremely bad things that happen in the human past is part of what we have to do as historians. And to deal with the level of atrocity we're dealing with here judiciously. I'm not going to say even-handedly, because certainly the perpetrators of such crimes do not deserve our sympathy, but they do perhaps deserve our understanding. Because it's very easy for us to, in our current situations, simply say that these are bad people doing bad things. But understanding why they did bad things is important, not in a psychological sense, but in a historical sense. And reading these sorts of books, even though they don't make for good bedtime reading, and they're probably not the kind of thing that you want to talk about around the family dinner table, reading these sorts of books really does help us understand an aspect of the human experience that we probably don't really like to think about. All right, that'll about wrap up for today. Looking forward to victory and defeat on Thursday. Keep the papers, etc. coming. Even if you're running behind, keep them coming on Blackboard. And even if you're thoroughly convinced you're all caught up on everything and you know right where you're at, check on Blackboard. Make sure that I am recording everything properly and I haven't missed anything. It's the last week of classes, so it's time to do that, whether we're online or whether we're in the classroom. All right, take care of yourselves, take care of your loved ones, follow public health directives, and I'll see you soon. Bye.